She had been warned to expect cruelty. A young Japanese nurse, barely 20, sat on a wooden bench inside a rough field hospital. Her uniform was torn, and blood stained her sleeve. The air carried the sharp scent of medicine and wet canvas. Across from her, an American medic gently wrapped a clean white bandage around her arm. His movements were calm, his voice low, more like a brother's care than an enemy's command. She didn't understand his words, but she understood his tone. It wasn't hate or victory. It was kindness, and it confused her deeply. Around her, other women were eating bowls of hot stew, more food than they'd had in days. Some were given clean clothes. Others had their wounds treated. It wasn't comfort, not yet. It was disbelief. All their lives, they had been told that being captured was worse than dying. They were taught that surrender was a shame that would dishonor their families and their emperor. During training, she had repeated the same oath: better to die than be taken. Every woman here believed capture meant humiliation and torture. But inside this tent, with the smell of coffee and bread, those beliefs began to crumble. When the Americans first approached, she had braced for violence and insults. Instead, one soldier offered her a cigarette. Another gave her water. When the medic touched her wound, she flinched, but he simply nodded and kept working. She stared at the bandage, wondering if this was a trick. Nothing in her past had prepared her for this. She had seen fellow soldiers left to die, food stretched so thin it barely kept them alive, and officers striking subordinates for showing weakness. Pain and obedience had defined loyalty. Mercy had no place in that world. Before the war ended in 1945, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers, and a smaller number of women, were taken prisoner. They had all been told that capture meant torture and disgrace. Yet, many found something unexpected: camps that followed the Geneva Convention. For the Americans, prisoners were more valuable alive, both for intelligence and moral reasons. To the Japanese, that idea was unimaginable. But for this young nurse, the shock was personal. The stew was rich and warm, filled with vegetables she hadn't seen in years. As she ate, her hands trembled, not from fear, but from disbelief. Beside her, an older woman began to cry, overcome by the simple kindness of being fed. Back home, propaganda had painted American camps as hellish. Yet here, guards learned their names, doctors treated them gently, and cooks served food as if feeding their own. The contrast was staggering, especially knowing that Allied prisoners under Japanese control were starved and beaten, with many never surviving. Still, suspicion lingered. Some women refused food, afraid it was poisoned. Others hid the chocolate they were given. The nurse hesitated when offered coffee, something she had never tasted. When she finally took a sip, the bitter flavor startled her, and the medic's soft laugh broke through the fear more powerfully than any words could. For women who had been stripped of individuality, these moments felt unreal. They were trained to serve, to suffer, to exist only as part of a machine. But here, each act of care, a bandage, a blanket, a warm meal, suggested that their lives mattered. The world had turned upside down. Women who expected death were being treated with dignity. At night, the camp was quiet, filled only with a hum of distant voices or a faint harmonica. Some lay awake, wondering if it was all a dream. Soon, a new thought began to spread among them. If the Americans weren't monsters, what else had been untrue? If surrender wasn't dishonor, what was? These questions grew louder when the nurse was given paper and a pencil. She was told she could write to her family. She hesitated, convinced it was impossible. Yet, she wrote, "Mother, I am alive. They feed me. They treat me kindly. I don't understand this war anymore." That letter never reached home. It was intercepted by Japanese officials who couldn't believe its message. How could such compassion exist in captivity? The nurse didn't know it yet, but the simple act of being cared for had begun to unravel a lifetime of beliefs. The next morning, she awoke not to shouting, but to the smell of bacon drifting through the camp. The air was cool, sunlight seeping through the cracks of the barracks. A calm voice called them to breakfast. Cautiously, they lined up, expecting cruelty, but were handed trays of eggs, bread, and coffee. When they saw the guards eating the same food, Their fear began to fade. The nurse took a trembling bite, soft bread, warm yolk, and tears filled her eyes. Around her, women ate in silence, caught between hunger and disbelief. One laughed nervously, but no punishment came. The guards barely looked up. Even the beds felt strange, wooden frames, thin mattresses, real blankets. After months on the ground, comfort itself felt wrong. She sat on her bed, clutching the blanket, realizing it was hers alone. It wasn't luxury, but it meant something. The camp still had fences and guards, yet inside was a contradiction. Captivity with compassion. In the afternoons, the women were even offered voluntary work. Some helped in the kitchens, learning how Americans bake bread with yeast instead of rice flour. For the young nurse, every new kindness challenged everything she had been taught. The war had taken her freedom, but it was here, behind barbed wire, that she began to understand humanity. Some women helped in the gardens or swept the campgrounds. One afternoon, the young nurse was handed a small packet of seeds. When she asked why, the guard pointed toward an empty patch of dirt. She didn't know the English words, but she understood the meaning. Grow something. To her, a nurse trained to stop bleeding and save lives, the idea of nurturing plants felt strange. Yet her hands shook, not from fear, but from a quiet excitement she hadn't felt in years. The next surprise came with paper and pencils. The prisoners were told they could write home. No one believed it at first. Surely the letters would never leave the camp. But soon, they sat in silence, each woman staring at the blank page before her. One wrote about the food, another about the clean beds, another about the kindness of the medics. For the first time, their voices, once silenced by strict discipline, flowed freely through ink. Those letters, censored but still revealing, reached Japan and stunned officials who read them. The words did not match the propaganda they had spread. Instead of cruelty, the letters spoke of care. In the evenings, the guards brought books and musical instruments. Some were in English, others translated into simple Japanese. A harmonica, a guitar, even a piano appeared in one camp. One night, the nurse sat quietly as another woman played a soft tune. The melody floated through the air, gentle, fragile, almost innocent. For the first time, music was not about orders or victory. It was about peace. Back in Japan, families starved. Children chewed bark to quiet their hunger. Reports said civilians survived on fewer than 200 calories a day in 1944. Yet inside the American camps, the prisoners grew healthier. Their faces filled out. Their strength returned. It was a cruel paradox. Captivity gave them more life than freedom had. At first, the women resisted these comforts. Accepting kindness felt like betrayal. Some sat stiffly while eating, refusing to thank anyone. Others ate food, expecting the generosity to vanish. But hunger and exhaustion slowly pushed away pride. A full stomach spoke louder than any old slogan. Each night, as the nurse wrapped her blanket around herself, the voice that once whispered shame grew softer. Another voice replaced it. Maybe I deserve this. The questions that followed were harder. How could the enemy treat them with more care than their own army had? How could strangers heal wounds their superiors ignored? One woman, once beaten for collapsing from fever, touched the arm where an American doctor had treated her infection. She said nothing, but her silence carried deep disbelief. Even laughter began to return. The day peanut butter was introduced, confusion swept the camp. One woman dipped her finger, tasted it, made a face, and spat it out to everyone's amusement. Soon, even the nurse smiled, laughing quietly with the others. That laughter cracked something open. The Americans were no longer faceless enemies. They were simply people. But beneath the warmth, heavier thoughts took root. Each gentle act challenged everything they had been taught. If surrender wasn't shameful, then what had all the dying been for? If kindness could come from the enemy, then who truly understood honor? Those questions lingered through every meal, every melody, every letter home. At night, the nurse lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought of her mother, hungry in a cold house, and her brothers marching in worn uniforms. She thought of the stew, the laughter, and the seeds waiting to grow. It felt like standing between two worlds, one fading, one uncertain. What unsettled her most wasn't the comfort. It was the idea that her life, her individual life, had value. That realization was more powerful than any weapon. Once dignity is felt, it cannot be forgotten. Days passed, and the rhythm of captivity became familiar. Morning roll call, breakfast, quiet hours filled with work or study. The fences were still there, sharp against the sky, but something inside those borders was changing. It was more than survival. It was a slow awakening of humanity. One afternoon, the nurse was given a piece of chalk in a small classroom. A guard, acting as a teacher, had written English words on a blackboard. She hesitated, then traced the letters of one word, asterisk home. Asterisk, the guard smiled and nodded. That small moment meant more than she could explain. In her world, learning had been about obedience and service. Here, it was about discovery. For the first time, she was learning because she mattered. Writing to her mother became another lesson. She didn't know what to say. How could she explain that she was fed while her family starved? That the Americans treated her wounds more gently than her own officers ever had? In the end, she wrote simply, "The food is warm, the beds are clean, the guards are kind." She didn't understand it, but she wanted her mother to know she was alive. When she later heard that officials in Japan read these letters, she wondered what they thought as they held her words. Did they see the truth breaking through? Even medicine carried new meaning. One woman, suffering from a long toothache, was taken to a camp dentist. She expected pain, but the American only smiled and promised to help. Moments later, the aching tooth was gone. For the first time, she felt relief. It wasn't just medical, it was personal. Pain didn't have to be endured. It could be eased. Faith found its place too. A few women built a tiny shrine in the corner of the barracks, afraid it might be torn down. When a guard saw it, he simply nodded and walked away. That quiet permission to believe freely was shocking. Others attended small Christian gatherings led by a chaplain who spoke softly, never forcing his words. Choice itself felt new, something their empire had never allowed. And always there was music. On calm nights, the sound of a harmonica floated across the camp, sometimes played by a guard, sometimes by a prisoner who had learned from him. The melody was uneven but full of warmth. The nurse would close her eyes and imagine a world without war. Each day deepened the contrast. What began as captivity was slowly becoming something else, a fragile rediscovery of what it meant to be human. Allied prisoners in Japanese camps were pushed to the limit, forced to work in jungles and mines until their bodies broke down. 1 in 3 never survived to see freedom. Yet here in American camps, the captured Japanese women were gaining weight, regaining strength, even laughing again. The contrast was almost unbearable. They had been told that Americans were monsters, but monsters didn't hand out sewing kits, books, or warm blankets. Every act of care chipped away at the fear that had ruled them for years. The change wasn't loud or dramatic. It grew quietly, in small moments. The nurse realized she no longer lowered her head when guards passed. She met their eyes, shyly but without fear. Another woman who once hid her food now ate openly. These simple acts signaled something bigger, a slow return of dignity. Still, shame lingered. At night, some women whispered that they could never face their families again. One even thought of ending her life. But another prisoner stopped her, holding her hands and saying, "If the enemy values our lives, why don't we?" That question settled deep in their hearts. Without realizing it, the Americans were reshaping their prisoners' sense of worth. Their kindness, practical though it was, became more powerful than any weapon. The women began to see dignity not as something earned through obedience or sacrifice, but as something every human being deserves. One rainy evening, the nurse received a pair of eyeglasses from an American doctor. When she put them on, everything became sharp, the world clear again. No one should live in a blur, the doctor said. She understood what he meant, not just about sight, but about life itself. For the first time, she saw herself clearly, but clarity came with pain. What did it mean to serve an empire that let its people starve while enemies showed compassion? What did loyalty mean in a world where mercy came from the other side? That confusion cut deeper than any wound. Each woman faced it in silence, but together they carried the same doubt. Had they betrayed their country, or had their country betrayed them? Rumors of their treatment began to spread beyond the camp. Stories of kindness, letters home, and captured women being treated with respect reached Japanese soldiers still fighting. Some began to hesitate before charging into hopeless battles, wondering if surrender might not be the end after all. That hesitation shook the empire to its core. The nurse didn't yet grasp how large this change was. But one evening, when she looked into a mirror borrowed from the infirmary, she saw not a prisoner, but a person, a human being with value, alive and irreplaceable. Once that truth took hold, there was no going back. When Japan's surrender was announced, the camp fell silent. No one cheered. They just sat there, stunned. The empire that had taught them death was honor had bowed its head. The barbed wire no longer marked their captivity. It marked the end of the war. Slowly, repatriation began. Trains, trucks, and ships carried the women home. The nurse boarded a vessel bound for Yokohama, clutching a few belongings, her blanket, her glasses, and the letter she had written to her mother. As the sea stretched endless and gray, she wondered, would she be welcomed or shunned? The Japan she returned to was shattered. Cities lay in ruins. People starved. Her mother was painfully thin. Food was nearly gone. Fuel was a luxury. The air was filled with talk of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and surrender. Amid the destruction, she carried memories that didn't fit, a world where even enemies showed kindness. She couldn't forget it, even though speaking of it felt dangerous. Other women returned with the same memories. Quietly, they spoke about guards who had remembered their names, nights filled with music, and doctors who treated them like people instead of soldiers. Some had learned English. Others read American books. These stories planted seeds of change. They began to question the beliefs they'd been raised on about honor, sacrifice, and what it truly meant to be loyal. Not everyone could bear it. Some were met with suspicion, accused of shame for surviving. Others stayed silent, burying the past. But a few spoke out, telling neighbors that the Americans hadn't been demons. They had been human, flawed, but compassionate. Their voices, small at first, helped build bridges during the occupation. American officers later admitted that humane treatment had achieved what violence never could. Prisoners shared information willingly, not from fear, but from gratitude. Some historians would argue that this policy helped end the war faster and save lives. But for the women, the real legacy wasn't political, it was personal. They had seen a world where dignity was given, not earned through pain. Months later, sitting beside her mother in their ruined home, the nurse boiled weeds into a thin soup. When her mother asked about the camp, she spoke softly about the food, the beds, the glasses that let her see again. Her mother began to cry, whispering, "At least someone remembered you were human." The irony was painful. The empire had promised glory and delivered hunger. The enemy had promised nothing and delivered kindness. The world had turned upside down. The women who lived through it would never see war the same way again. Some dedicated their lives to peace, teaching their children that compassion is stronger than cruelty. Others simply carried the lesson quietly, letting it shape how they lived. Even decades later, survivors remembered every detail. One said, "They gave me chocolate. I didn't believe it was real until I saw the guard eat the same piece. That moment changed me." Another said, "I learned English in that camp. I still dream in it." These memories became a mosaic of truth that no propaganda could erase. The revolution of dignity didn't overthrow governments, but it changed hearts. It proved that even in war, kindness could break the hardest walls. The nurse who once believed her only worth was obedience now knew her life mattered on its own. She had been valued, cared for, and seen. The Americans might not have intended to create such change, but their humanity had done what weapons never could. It had shown that mercy could win battles too. When she walked through the ruins of Tokyo, saw occupation soldiers handing food to starving children, or held her mother's hand at night, she remembered the camp, not as a prison, but as a strange place where humanity had survived. The women carried home small objects, blankets, letters, glasses, but they were symbols of something greater. Proof that even in the darkest times, dignity can endure. The greatest revelation wasn't that the Americans had been kind. It was that kindness itself could exist in a world built on destruction. As their story spread through homes, towns, and across oceans, they left behind one haunting question. If a piece of paradise could exist inside a prison, what did that say about the world outside?